This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. The interview you're about to hear is 1 hour, 34 minutes, and 25 seconds long. If you love it, it will fly by in an instant. If you hate it, it will last an eternity. It was recorded at 1 p.m. Pacific Time on Tuesday, January 14th. But you can listen to it at any time. While you're listening to it, your mind might wander off into different places and different times. But that's okay, because my guest this week and I both want you to think about when you are and when you would like to be. This is my mind-bending and time-bending interview with Venkatesh Rao. So I am in downtown Los Angeles in the famous Bradbury Building, which is very appropriate for this conversation. It's appropriate for the person I'm sitting with, too, to be working here. This is Venkatesh Rao, who's a fellow this year at the, how's it pronounced? Berggruen Institute. And you must have been quite excited when you were offered this fellowship to know that it was in the Bradbury Building. Or was that part of it?
Once I found out what the Bradbury Building was,
you didn't know.
Then it was exciting.
Okay.
Because, like once I made the connection to, the Hollywood history and stuff.
So for people that don't know, can you just tell them why this is important and why it's significant for you in particular?
So this is the building where several key scenes in the original Harrison Ford Blade Runner were filmed. And that's kind of interesting because actually it's particularly interesting right now because the original Blade Runner movie is set in November 2019.
Oh,
and that was just a couple of months ago. And we actually did a little viewing of the original movie here in the Bradbury Building. So it was kind of surreal to see the movie play out with scenes from the building while sitting inside the building on the exact time the movie is set in.
Wow. Yeah. So you're interested in science fiction.
Absolutely. I'm an engineer. So
you're an engineer, so
you have to be.
You have to be. Is this true? Is it that ubiquitous among engineers?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's probably the most favorite genre of pulp among engineers.
Yeah. And science fiction. Guess how many books of science fiction I've read? None. So I'm an absolute ignoramus. I am not worthy of your presence. But as I understand it, many, if not all, I don't know, science fiction novels or stories take place, in a sense, out of time. Do they not?
That would be a simple question for most people, but
someone who's been studying and writing about time for years. This is a much more, and this is where we're going, people. We're gonna be talking about time here.
So it's interesting you use the phrase "out of time" because if you go back to say the Greek gods of time, there are actually three gods: Chronos, Kairos, and Aeon. A-I-O-N. That's where we get the word Aeon, the historical period, epoch. Mm-hmm. And the best understanding I've had of Aeon is it's the personification of time outside of time. So it's not like, it's not the same as immortality or an infinity in time. It's sort of outside of time per se, where, time doesn't exist. So that notion of like almost the opposite of time. And if I think of it that way, there aren't actually many science fiction works that explore that dimension of time that are basically outside of time altogether. Like one I can think of is the character of Q in Star Trek: The Next Generation. So Q is a member of a species from the Q continuum, which has some resemblance to like a space that's outside of the normal time we experience.
So this is where there is no chronology at all. This space, there's no marking of the passage of. How are you defining time? This is one of the hardest conversations.
Yeah, it's really hard to have this conversation, but there's a few ways to get at it,
and it's so important.
Yeah, so if you look at sort of traditional classical conceptions of time, we approach it through metaphors like a flowing continuum, and if you think of it in those terms, it's hard to think of the concept of time even stopping, let alone moving orthogonal to time in a dimension where time does not exist, right? It seems like abstract gobbledygook that kind of, just stringing words together that actually don't point to anything. But there's actually a sense in which that sort of thing happens both in fiction and reality. Like the reality version of it is, if you look at modern physics-based conceptions of time, over the last century, all our familiar intuitions of time are basically breaking down. And today you can actually construct fundamental theories of physics that don't actually involve an explicit time variable. And time becomes a matter of like informational perspective. A good book I would recommend for this is Carlo Rovelli's Order of Time, where he talks about all our intuitions of time, sequentiality, flow, continuity, order, causation, all of them break down under the right conditions. And this is, of course, things like relativistic regimes or going into quantum regimes, or some regimes like we'll never ever actually access, like what's known as the Planck constant length. Are you familiar with that?
No.
So the Planck constant is basically the smallest length in space that's meaningfully defined.
Okay.
Like the very concept of space breaks down when you go smaller than the Planck length.
Okay.
And the Planck time is the time it takes light to travel the Planck length. So basically the concept of time breaks down below the Planck constant. So, or Planck length. And that's a very literal, real physics, meaningful sense of a space where time does not exist, right? And if you go the other direction, so that's the physics understanding of time, then on the subjective psychological understanding of time, you have the same kind of sort of effect in extreme regimes. So just as you have to go into like, extreme velocities and scales to get to time and space breaking down in physics, you have to go to extreme regimes of the psyche for time to break down and subjectivity. And one really interesting paper I read recently was the effect of torture and the post-traumatic stress of torture on people who've been prisoners of war. And this paper talks about how your sense of time basically collapses. So it's an extreme case of what psychologists call a sense of foreshortened future. So anytime you have trauma, the more extreme, the worse it gets. But trauma breaks down your sense of time progressively. And one extreme is, of course, torture. And the other extreme is like, I'm just recovering from a cold for 3 weeks. And when you have a cold, time starts to slow down. You get really impatient. It's like you feel you've been sniffling for an hour and you look at the clock, only 10 minutes have passed. So that's, on the other edge of like time starting to break down. But these, both the physics objective and, psychological subjective notions of time, one way to think of it is they are very much constructed realities, and these constructed senses of time, which is, I use the word temporality to refer specifically to the constructed sense of time, they only sort of exist in a stable way in relatively narrow regimes. Like, just like humans can only live in this Goldilocks zone where Earth is in, broader outer space, there's a narrow range of like objective and subjective conditions under which our sense of normal intuitions of time actually hold. So you have to be traveling far slower than the speed of light. You have to be operating at scales that are not Planck scale. That's on the objective front. And on the subjective front, you have to be, not being tortured, right? So it's a fairly narrow range of conditions under which our normal intuitions of time are actually meaningfully stable.
Okay. So this is fascinating so far. The psychological and cultural subjective conceptions of time. I think that was your phrase. Let's stay with that because I don't know science. And also your work really, I think it's really, you're not sort of dealing with scientific questions so much as I think cultural and psychological questions. Okay, good. I got that right. Let's go back to the Greek gods. Okay. And you mentioned this third one that I haven't heard you talk about before. Ion or Ion or
Ion. It's sort of A-I-O-N.
Out of time entirely. This god represents that. Yeah. Okay, but the main two you talk about, right, are Chronos and Kairos. And just you want to talk about the difference between the two and how they shaped Western civilization and culture, right?
Yeah. So let's talk about gods of time in general as well. But just to say a little bit more on the relationship between the scientific physics understanding of time and the sort of psychologist understanding of time.
Sure.
This has been one of the most powerful debates in the last century in Western culture. And a sort of historic event in the conversation was a debate between Albert Einstein and Andre Bergson in 1922 when relativity was first sort of coming up on the world stage. And that debate could be seen as like the culminating end of history event of like a 2,000-year sort of debate on the nature of time, objective and subjective. And Andre Bergson kind of represented the sort of subjectivist approach to time. So I just wanted to mention that as sort of a bookend event, the sort of before and after that event, our understanding of time.
1922.
Roughly 1922.
Okay.
So I wanted to mention that. But okay, to your question on the gods of time. So the Greeks had Chronos and Kairos as two conceptions of time. And Chronos is linear, objective, out there in the world, materialistic sense of time. So Chronos is what a clock measures. And Kairos is a subjective sense of time as perceived by a living sentient creature. And it includes connotations of risk and opportunity, the time being right for something, like, a Shakespearean sense of, a time and tide. There's a tide in the affairs of men. That's a quote from, I think, Julius Caesar. Right. So that notion of just a sense that this is the time to act. And a good way to get at the symbolism of these two personifications is Chronos is the original. This is CHRONOS, Chronos. And Chronos is often conflated with Cronus, CRONUS, was the Greek precursor to Saturn. And because of this sort of almost deliberate conflation, Chronos and Cronus became part of like the figure of Saturn in Roman mythology. And Saturn is the god of time in Roman mythology. And then Saturn gave rise to the modern figure of Father Time or Death, which is, the guy in a black hood with a scythe. And Chronos, so this is the Chronos line of personification, is associated with the idea of harvesting of souls. That's why he carries a scythe. So he's not just the god of like objective time, he's also the god of death. And this makes sense because death is the one sort of undeniable part of like the objective part of time that you cannot subjectively deny, right? So when you die, the sort of null hypothesis is time ends for you. Like it might go on for others in the universe, but fundamentally your participation in time, you as one of the 7 billion human threads of time, ends. Right? So Chronos so that's one important.
So Chronos is the clock, the watch, the alarm clock. Yeah, all that stuff that I've been railing against for years publicly. People who know me know that I'm not a fan of Chronos. Okay.
And Kairos. So Kairos is the more sort of subjective sense, and if we trace that, it's much harder to pin down. So just as Chronos is represented with a scythe, representing mortality and death and the objectivity of time that cannot be denied, Kairos is usually represented with a pair of scales. So things hanging in the balance. So I think of my personal interpretation of the scales as risk versus opportunity. So because in a way, if you think of subjective experience of time, it's this continuous stream of consciousness, of decisions, always weighing what to do next. Sometimes you have this sort of smoothly flowing stream of consciousness. Other times it's like your mind is torn between two worlds, horns of a dilemma, where you're trying to choose which world you want to make real, right? So that's the scales kind of personifies that really well. And if you sort of trace the history of these two personifications of time through Western history, you get I would say the next important stopping point is Leibniz versus Spinoza. So Spinoza sort of inaugurated modern Western philosophy, and you could say his contribution to thinking about time is basically all in on Chronos. Not necessarily deny subjectivity, but sort of downplay it and make it subservient to objective understandings of time. And Leibniz, in his time, he was something of a sort of genius reactionary of sorts, where even though he invented calculus and sort of laid the foundations of modern physics along with Newton, fundamentally he kind of wanted to reconstruct an Aristotelian notion of time in sort of a way that would be robust to the kinds of thinking Spinoza was bringing on the scene. And that was fascinating. And that's how he came up with things like, he came up with this weird philosophy called monadology, which is kind of like,
I've read the monad. What's it called? I read that. It's called
monadology. I think that's the book.
It's the weirdest philosophical text I've ever read.
Yes, but if you see why he got there and how he got there, it's kind of fascinating. One of the things, I haven't fully understood his project, and partly it was kind of a sign of its times, but he was trying to rescue subjectivity in time. So in his sense,
I wish I had known when I read it.
Because it sort of fits in with things like, the calculus was invented partly to think about how can you infinitely subdivide time, Zeno's paradox, things like that.
Okay.
And he was also the father of digital computers. Like he came up with the earliest known conception of a computer.
Leibniz?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
He came up, and he came up with this notion which he called horologium Dei, the god of the time, the clock of the gods or something. Okay. And that was sort of the overarching theme of monadology. And so I shouldn't say too much about this because I'm not a Leibniz expert. So this is a very superficial Wikipedia level gloss of the ideas. But so the reason I want to point that out is I think that was the next milestone in sort of the evolution of the debate on time. That continued for a couple of centuries. And then you get to Henri Bergson and turn of the 20th century notions.
Hold on. So the Enlightenment philosophers generally, right? They embrace Chronos.
Pretty much.
Very much, don't they? I mean, they're for me, they're the ones really imposing this idea, which to me becomes a regimentation.
Yeah. So the regimentation kind of.
Is that too strong, or is that?
I would say it's sort of a natural consequence, not of the Enlightenment per se, but a century or two later, the Industrial Revolution.
Yes.
Because it actually took the invention of the steam engine and the decoupling of time and energy and all those other things that define the Industrial Revolution.
Oh, sure. I mean, the Enlightenment philosophers were writing books that almost no one read. But in terms of popularizing it, meaning, and I should say imposing it on a mass scale, absolutely, I've always identified the rise of industrial capitalism as the origin of that. Where people were, for the first time, and then it's the 19th century, basically. For the first time, most people in the West, at least, are looking at a clock. Mm-hmm. For the first time. Yeah. For the first time, they're thinking about time in that way, in that regimented, logical way.
Yeah. So I think you can have a couple of different views on this, on sort of the causal effect of the Enlightenment philosophers on the technological revolution that followed. Mm-hmm. Certainly, there's a line of thought there. So one very important line I want to trace is Galileo's discovery of the principle of the pendulum. This was, I think, 1607.
Cool.
Was actually very crucial to the development of Spinoza's philosophy and also Leibniz's philosophy. And Spinoza, one of his sort of close collaborators and compatriots of his time was Christian Huygens, and Huygens invented the first pendulum clock. So all these are very closely correlated in time. And this is another thing people don't know about Spinoza, but he was a lens crafter. That's how he paid the bill. So he was a lens grinder. And if you think about that time, the measurement of time and the ability to use microscopes to look at bacteria and things like that, all these things were having a very particular effect on philosophy and theology of those times. And the reason Spinoza became sort of the original sort of naturalist philosopher of the West was that all these sort of developments in the empirical relationship between human cognition and the world, like the pendulum clock becoming the mediator of human psychology and time, the lens becoming the mediator between human psychology and like small scales, and the telescope, again, Galileo, becoming the mediator between the human eye and the stars. It forced like the people who are willing to admit that these were important things were forced to admit that we have to stop sort of just making up bullshit just because it sounds good. We can't pretend that the stars are sort of these immutable little points of light on the firmament. They are things that you can examine with a telescope, and they have properties that you actually have to acknowledge, right?
And you can measure.
Yeah, you can measure.
So measurement this is primary here.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. So it started this tradition of
like you and I have been talking for 18 minutes and 32 seconds.
Yeah,
right?
and that's a fact that you have, whatever that means, whatever it means for a clock to measure 18 minutes, that can be debated.
But without all these bastards like Galileo and Spinoza, we wouldn't have that conception. Or maybe we'd have a different, or some different conception.
So this is, I think, another important philosophical debate point about to what extent was the invention of physical artifacts as the sort of intermediary realities between human brains and sort of natural realities. To what extent was the actual existence of physical artifacts important? And some people think maybe it was not that important. Other people think that the instrumentation of cognition was actually crucially important. And I happen to fall in that camp where I think the mind started getting really strongly shaped by the fact that we were attaching instruments to it.
Oh, instruments like the watch and the clock.
Clock,
sure.
Any kind of machine. So
sure.
Because what happens when you attach a machine to your brain is you can no longer draw a sharp line between where your body and interiority ends and where the rest of the world begins, right? So subjectivity and objectivity becomes sort of this fuzzy transition zone, and we can get into that in modern times with transhumanism and things like that. You know,
slow down, all right, Venkat. Okay, here we go. No, that was an incredible thing you said about the when you attach instrumentation to the body or body and consciousness, I suppose, right? It's both, isn't it? What happens?
The idea that there's like a very clean philosophical separation between subjectivity and what you might say interiority, like the inside of me, versus the outside and objectivity, it starts to blur, right?
Why? I mean, I probably agree with you. I just want this to be laid out.
So there's another sort of train of thought that's been developed over several centuries. But the one I like most is Marshall McLuhan's idea of media as extensions of the body.
Okay.
So that's a very modern understanding that kind of we can resonate with. But you find that going back all like, let me think of a couple of other ones, like Hannah Arendt. One of her sort of foundational ideas on how she develops her ideas of history is that there are three key events in Western history that altered the human condition. One of them was actually the invention of the telescope. And she makes this instrumentality argument that, all right, once the telescope was invented and it became this physical object that became sort of a bridge between your mind and the universe at large, you kind of couldn't think the same way because it altered your sense of being in the world. It moved you more from what, so she, I'm sort of wandering all over the place here, but Hannah Arendt is sort of a philosopher of vita activa. So that's another distinction that we get from the Greeks and Romans. So vita contemplativa is this sense of like contemplation and philosophy as the act of retreating into your own mind and sort of thinking about free will or consciousness or whatever the hell philosophers like to think about. And vita activa is this notion that no, philosophy is fundamentally the praxis of being in the world and sort of understanding how you're situated in the world and sort of trying to make sense of that. And Hannah Arendt is one of the most important philosophers of the latter. And her point is crucial, that how you're situated in the world is a function of how you're instrumentally connected to the world. And as that alters and reshapes, the boundary between who you are and the rest of the world blurs, distorts, reshapes, becomes bigger, smaller.
Okay, so there's the moon, there's you, and then there's the telescope, right? There's three objects we're talking about here, or maybe a subject and two objects. But what you're saying, I guess, am I right, is that the mediating instrument, in this case, the telescope, affects our consciousness, becomes maybe a part of our consciousness, and becomes a part, therefore, of ourselves.
Exactly. Like, think about it if the telescope weren't a physical artifact, but just a natural extension of the eye, and biologically we were capable of zooming in and out to look at moon's craters, right?
Nice.
We would actually think very differently.
That's right.
And one way to make this understanding really visceral, This is an idea I just encountered this week, and I might not remember the phrase for it correctly, but there's this way, I think it's called the homunculus neuro something, but we can look it up and link it in your notes later. But it's if you take the brain's neural sort of density of neural connections to its sense organs and sort of rebuild the way the human body looks based on the density of how many neurons are coming from a part of your body into your brain, you get this really cartoonish thing. So for example, we have a huge number of nerve endings in our tongue and our fingertips, right? So this homuncular sort of cartoon, it has huge hands and like a tongue that's hanging out like a dog's. Our eyes become huge. So it's the body sort of visualized from this point of view of the nerve endings as seen by the brain. And it's very different from the sort of external view of the body.
The sensory receptors.
Yeah, sensory receptors.
Primary. Okay.
And now just take that argument and attach it to the Marshall McLuhan medium is the message idea or Hannah Arendt's instrumentality and ask, now what happens if it turns out that we can attach microscopes and telescopes to our eyes? What does it do to how our brain sees the body, right? So that's a very visceral sort of visualization of the boundary between inner experience and outer experience, inner time and outer time.
It changes our consciousness about the world outside and inside. Yeah. That's right. We literally see the world differently in this case we're talking about, right? Okay. So you before we started rolling, I was talking about how much I hate Chronos and kind of like Kairos, and you were saying, well, I don't make a value judgment on either one, but it seems like your project at least has been critical, I think, of the effect of what we're calling Chronos, this conception of time, which became dominant in the 19th century and continued to be dominant well into the 20th century. You sort of mark the beginning of its end sort of in the 1970s, I think, right? Or
yeah.
Okay, right. I got that right too. And the rise of Kairos, which we'll get into in a second. But you're not a big fan, right, of what the effects of this idea of Chronos and that kind of time.
Okay, I think I see a way to sort of make a distinction that would be helpful here. Okay. So one of my background is as an engineer, and one of the things you learn as an engineer is there's no point getting mad at facts. It's like, you can't have a critical view of gravity. You drop a thing, it falls. It is what it is. Okay. You want to design machines, you design it around the fact that things fall in a gravity field, right? Yeah. And I think the way to get at the distinction you're driving at is it's useful to think of time as the sort of unalterable natural phenomena, whatever you want to call it, both subjective and objective, as the natural objective thing you can study as a scientist or a philosopher or a psychologist, right? A clock is a device that ticks in a certain way. That's just phenomenology. You can't do much with it. Subjective time works a certain way. You have a cold, time slows down. You take nootropics, time gets altered in certain ways. So these are like the raw facts of time experience. But what you construct on that foundation of what you cannot change, that's a matter of social reality construction. So that's the loose distinction I make between time and a temporality. A temporality is a constructed experience of time where we have a fair amount of creative freedom. So for example, the 9-to-5 workday is not actually a feature of objective time or Chronos, even though it's sort of part of a Chronos temporality. Nobody says that we have to organize and structure objective time using a 9-to-5 workday clock, right? It could be 8-to-4, it could be flex time, you could work in completely different ways. So in that sense,
it's a cultural norm.
Yeah, it's a cultural norm, it's a constructed social reality. So that I would call a Chronos biased temporality, right? And a Chronos biased temporality is neither necessary nor sort of an unqualified universally good thing. It's good for certain situations and societal conditions. It's not so good for other situations and societal conditions. So that, we can talk about, and you can have an ideological debate about the historical pattern of the rise and fall of that.
Yeah, let's do that right now. Awesome. Chronos biased temporality.
All right.
That's why I'm talking to you, because I get phrases like that. So I see that as becoming dominant in certainly American culture, because I know that the best, but I think in Western culture generally in the 19th century, as we were talking about, with, I think, the rise of industrial capitalism. And I think you agree with that as well. So I have written and talked a lot about the first factories and what happened in the first factories here and in England, which was in the early 19th century. They built these big boxes and they invited all these basically peasants to work there. And they said, well, you're going to show up at 8 o'clock in the morning and you're going to leave at 8 o'clock at night, because that's how long the workday was typically, right? And by the way, this day is called Monday and tomorrow is called Tuesday and the day after that's called Wednesday. And by the way, the time never changes among those days, regardless of when the sun rises and regardless of whether the roosters crow. You cowpoke, right? And get in the box and do the work. And also, you're going to work according to these things called hours and minutes. And you're going to work at a particular pace, which is going to be dictated by that big thing on the wall that we're calling a clock that keeps ticking, ticking, ticking relentlessly in a regimented way. It never alters, it never changes, and nor will you if you're a good worker. Okay. Now, what happened was, it turned out a lot of the workers were human beings. And had never done this before and weren't used to being and living according to a clock, weren't used to being made into a machine in a sense, right? I called it the machinification. Here's a Venkatesh Rao kind of line. The machinification of the human body is what I call it. And there was a resistance to it, usually tacit, usually unconscious. We don't have records of people like holding up signs protesting the imposition of time or chronos-based temporality. They just didn't show up on time.
Yeah.
They didn't leave when they left early. They left earlier than when they were supposed to. They took very long lunch breaks, at the wrong time. They didn't work in these predictable patterns, these steady patterns, right? They didn't turn that screw over and over again according to, 5 times every minute or whatever the rate was. So we see this great amount of resistance to what we're talking about, to this chronos biased temporality, which became the dominant regime in the Western civilization in the 19th century. You're shaking your head.
So it's interesting because, all right, since you've provided your narrative of what happened, I'll give you my narrative, which is, I think there's a large elements of overlap where we agree, but it's probably just a matter of shifted emphasis and sort of hypotheses about where all this came from.
The new Renegade University has new courses on the history of race in America, the politics of sex work with Maggie McNeil, an introduction to Nietzsche with Daniel Coffeen, and my new What is Postmodernism course. We also have a large catalog of courses featuring my Renegade History of the United States series, Scott Horton's courses on American foreign policy, and my histories of the United States in the 19th century and of World War II. We're also about to release 2 brand new courses, The History of Martial Arts with Daniele Bolelli, and An Instructional Design for Dying with Tom Nickel. But what makes Renegade University fundamentally different than all other online universities and even most brick-and-mortar universities is that you get to talk one-on-one with us, the instructors, via what we call office hours. Students and members of RU also can talk to each other on our very own social media platform, which is completely free of censors from Facebook or Twitter or the government. At Renegade University, you can say exactly what you want to say. So join us, become a member, go to renegadeuniversity.com. And right now, for a limited time, we are offering 30 to 40% off everything at the brand new RU as part of our grand launch sale. So join the revolution and go to renegadeuniversity.com.
So for starters, I don't think the origin of this actually lies with industrialization proper. It lies with religion. So if you look for before industry, where did time regimentation and oppressive sort of objective time cultures came from? It was religion. Like before factories dictated the meaning of an hour or the meaning of sunset and sunrise, churches and temples did. And if you look at the class of professionals that was concerned the most with keeping time measurements accurate and precise, it was priests and religious figures. And a few examples to just illustrate that point. Calendar reform. Julian calendar to Gregorian calendar, that was done by the Catholic Church. If you look in the East, the entire sort of traditional system of calendars in India is completely built around auspicious times for various sort of religious rituals and so forth. And these are, the entire field of astrology, which predates astronomy, is all about finding auspicious times for various things to happen. If you look at where the earliest clock-making disciplines arrived in both China and Europe, It was people trying to figure out the right timing for like ceremonial and ritual functions.
The church bell.
Yeah, the church bell.
Hey.
But let's actually get even deeper
Time to
into
pray.
that.
Yeah.
One of the earliest and most challenging engineering tasks in clockmaking that was sort of people were trying for like centuries and never got it right with the mechanical clock was actually a clock that could tell the timing of Easter. Because Easter is a weird festival on the Western calendar. It doesn't quite fit the solar calendar as well. And so there's similar problems in other calendaring systems. But actually trying to figure out the timing of Easter drove a lot of innovation in horology in the West. Similarly, in the East, in Islamic time cultures, trying to figure out the exact time of the beginning of the Ramadan moon, that was a very precise astronomical timing event that around which an entire priesthood grew, right? So that's one point I want to make, where the starting point is.
Great.
So the inference to take away from that is it's not so much that humans resisted regimentation and coercion in temporal forms. It's the source of where that coercion was coming from, and their own personal sort of involvement and acceptance of the justifications involved, right? So yes, if you're a very religious person, you will actually be more conscientious than the most conscientious priest about timing. Like there are really religious people who get upset at priests for not being conscientious enough about keeping calendars and clocks correctly. And you actually see versions of that in industrial temporality as well. So yes, for the most part, you're correct that the peasantry resisted being drafted into factory work cultures. This is not new, by the way. If you look at James Scott's work on the sedentarization of early, nomadic cultures
in Southeast Asia, yeah.
No, I'm talking about his more recent work Against the Grain, which was the Neolithic Revolution, and his study of what did it take for settled cities and settled agriculture to displace pastoral nomadic, tribal people. And it turns out it was not like, we now know how to plant crops and now we'll just settle down because it's easy to eat grown food. No, it was like several thousands of years of like resistance and famines and deep stress under which they said, screw it, we are enduring a deep famine and therefore we're going to accept settled life. Like people resisted settled agricultural civilization for a really long time, if you believe James Scott.
Yeah.
So this was a very similar event, except 10,000 years later.
Yeah.
And so people resisted. Eventually, they kind of forgot. You could think of it as a kind of learned helplessness where they forgot that they hated it or something.
Yeah.
But yes, I think it actually continued throughout, even to the present day. Like it's a trope in fiction. Like, railing against the clock is a big thing.
This morning, when my alarm went off, I mean, as much as I love you, I didn't really want to get up, and I'm sure you had a similar experience. Right?
But let me connect the dots to religion, sort of bring out the other side, which is when people believe in the mission of an industrial project, just as when they believe in the mission of a religious project, like, building a cathedral or something, they forget all their sort of resistance of like oppressive time cultures and become very eager to do it right. And I have a wonderful example of this. So during the Apollo project, there were like extremely stringent sort of statistical criteria imposed on the reliability of parts, how frequently they would fail, how once in so many thousands of times the part could fail, and therefore what are the risks of a lunar mission. And this was Neil Armstrong in an interview at some point. He mentioned that there were all these really stringent requirements to ensure the safety of the crew during the Apollo missions. And the rockets and things worked so well, they blew those requirements out of the water. And his explanation was everybody on the Apollo program, they were really, really invested in this mission, this completely freaking arbitrary mission of landing a human being on the moon, was so inspiring that they actually voluntarily and willingly subjected themselves to the most extreme rigors of industrialization that had been seen in the world to date, and voluntarily sort of met and exceeded the most stringent expectations. And that tells me that that's actually the key part, which is not so much the fact of clocks being in the picture or timekeepers and oppressive priests being in the picture. It's a question of, is there a sense of mission underlying the activity that inspires you to actually accept that and exceed it?
Yeah. I mean, if you believe in the thing, if you believe in God or you believe in this new God called time, you don't need to be told, you don't need to be coerced or whipped or shamed. You do it yourself. That's why I think the wristwatch became, next to the business suit, the symbol of the businessman in the 20th century.
Yep.
Right?
And that story is actually kind of interesting, and most of it is, I would say, voluntary. Like, there's the aspect of the story you brought out that I think Marxist historians especially have worked out very well. There's this sense of like, I think it was Jeremy Rifkin who wrote this polemic called Time Wars, which is sort of a big history of basically a war over time as the story of industrialization. But there's also this other story of people being obsessed with time, falling in love with clocks and the railroads, and sort of obsessively getting more into time than they needed to, right?
Right.
And
the railroad fetish of the early 20th century.
And clocks themselves, like the richest people, like if you go to clock museums, you'll find all these sort of fascinating, truly expensive 18th and 19th century clocks that the nobility really sort of got really into. And
what's the most famous landmark in London? Big Ben.
Yeah. And Big Ben, I think, is actually, in my head canon story of time, it's one bookend with the other bookend being GPS satellites. So Big Ben was 1854, I think. That was when, for the first time, a late era clock tower that evolved from like church clock towers became big enough and powerful enough to basically create coordinated time at the scale of a city.
Yes.
And I think of the history of the synchronization of the world as having three parts. There's the production of time. So production of time is just get more and more accurate at more accurate than the sun at keeping time. So that was the whole story. It was driven in part by the need to track longitude correctly for navigating to the new world. So between Christian Huygens and John Harrison, who invented the marine chronometer, you see mainly an evolution in the production of time. How accurately can you produce time? Okay. Then you shifted to distribution.
Distribution. I love this, your formulation. I've heard you say this, that you call it the distribution of time.
Yeah.
Distribution of, everyone listen to that, distribution of time. That is so counterintuitive, but I think you're so right.
Yeah. And once you were able to produce time, it became obvious that it's like almost like, electricity style utility that can be increasingly distributed. So the earliest zones of distribution were about the size of a machine. So the steam engine governor, James Watt's innovation was what's known as the governor. It basically synchronized the movement of the engine in time. So this was known as the governor. And if you think about that, that's a way of producing time that's powerful enough to control the operation of a single steam engine. Then you had clocks and watches, which went slowly larger and larger from village scale to city scale. Then you had the railroads, which started distributing it at first country scale, then continent scale, with the telegraph that was possible to synchronize across the entire United States. And that's how you went from like several hundred time zones to 4 time zones, because it was needed for the railroads to function. Then if you move into the modern era with the invention of the electric grid, the first grid synchronized electric clocks came about sometime, I think, in the 1920s or 30s. So, the familiar bedside clocks that most old hotels still have with like the little LED displays. The first versions of that were in the 1930s. And the way these things work, for those of you who are not familiar with the engineering, is they use the 60 hertz cycle of electric grid power distribution as their way to measure the second. So this leads to very weird effects, by the way. So for example, a few years ago, I think in Ukraine, there was a disruption of the electric grid that led to the slowing down of the Earth cycle. So everybody's clock slowed down. So 1930s, you started seeing the electric grid. So this, if you think about sort of the spatial extent, the railroads allowed you to distribute time along like big railroad lines, like, the east to west transcontinental railroad of the US. The electric grid made it 2D, sprawled across the entire landmass. So anywhere electricity could go, a synchronized time signal could go. During World War II, you had LORAN, which started these low-frequency radio signals across the oceans that allowed ships to be brought into the distribution grid. Then you will go from LORAN to eventually GPS. So there's a couple more milestones along the way. But GPS right now is, 32 satellites creating this cage of time, as I like to call it, orbiting the Earth. That comes down to cell phone towers. So cell phone towers synchronize their times using GPS signals. And by the way, electric grid also uses GPS now to synchronize time. And the cell phone tower is how your cell phone, your smartphone, gets its time signal. So all of us mostly use our phones now as time indicators. That comes via GPS from the cell phone signal. But the GPS satellites themselves, each of them carries a rubidium atomic clock. So that's how time is produced and distributed globally today. And there's more to the story.
I know but just hang on here. The distribution of time then leads to ever greater, you said, synchronization of the world.
Exactly.
Or synchronization of space, or ever larger spaces. Like Big Ben, right, could be heard through much of London, right?
Yep.
All at the same time, essentially, by this mass of people. You left the people out of your story there, right? But
we'll talk about
people. But it's then what happens is then the people can either decide to comply with this, think that it's correct, think that it should be obeyed, or they can resist and go to the movies instead of going to work, right?
Yep.
And that's what you're talking about. So that's just a brilliant formulation.
So let's
keep going. Yes.
We'll talk a little bit more about that, but I do want to switch to subjectivity and humans in a minute. But the one sort of additional point I want to make is space is important, but if you think about space and time, I think time is the more important and fundamental variable. So thinking about synchronization not just across the globe, but across time is very important. And the best modern example I can think of is the Google Authenticator. So I don't know if most of your...
What is this?
So if you want to keep your online accounts safe from hacking and identity theft, you should use something called Google Authenticator. So this is a public service announcement I'm making for you and your audience separately.
Good to know, thank you.
But Google Authenticator is this app you download on your phone, which you synchronize with a QR code with any service you want to use. So maybe you want to use Gmail for your email, and Gmail will allow you to set up what's known as two-factor authentication, where you scan a QR code on the Gmail site. It'll sync up the Authenticator app on your phone with that. And what it does is it creates on both sides, the server and your phone, a little random number seed where even if the two are disconnected, they basically evolve in time the same way. So the way this is used is when you log in, it'll ask you for a second factor to verify that you are who you say you are. You'll pull up the app on your phone and it'll show you a number. And that number you will type into a field in Gmail and it'll log you in. So it's a second factor ensuring who you are and that you're in possession of your phone.
And it's a time marker, is that right?
It's just a random number. So it might say 345892.
But it's indexed to time.
Yes, okay, so that's what I'm getting at.
Yes, okay.
So the window of synchronization is 20 seconds. So for 20 seconds, if you type in that number in Gmail, it'll actually verify you, because what's happening is the same program is running on Google servers as on your phone, but they're not actually connected. So independently in space, like this could be on opposite sides of the planet, two algorithms are running that are synchronized to within 20 seconds so precisely that you can actually use that synchronization signal to actually verify who you are to a computer on the other side of the planet, and therefore use that service. Look at the journey we've gone from John Harrison's marine chronometer, where it was like hugely inaccurate marine clocks that allow you to figure out where your ship. This was, by the way, very crucial back then. If you didn't get the time measurement right when you were sailing from England to the US, you could be hundreds of miles away from where you thought you were, and you'd land in, I don't know, Plymouth Rock instead of Jamestown. I'm just making that one up. But that was the importance of synchronization in the age of sail. And sail is like one of the slowest technologies from our present perspective. And today we are talking about speed of light communications and the effects of synchronization between a server and your phone up to 20 seconds. And we use that to just project our own identities, our subjective identities, to a computer on the other side of the planet, right? So I just want to pause a minute to appreciate the magnitude of what we've accomplished. This is why I can't be a social historian, Marxist, and hate Chronos. It's like you have to fall in love with the beauty of the story, right?
I don't. I'm not a Marxist or a socialist, but it terrifies me. The idea that we are all now in sync. And I don't mean the boy band from the 80s or 90s, whatever they were, 90s. That doesn't frighten you a bit?
I think it's, again, we have to make a distinction between time and temporality. So the time part doesn't scare me. I just think of it as more and more sort of control and command over and understanding. Think of this as understanding of the nature of time in a physics sense and psychology sense. That part doesn't scare me at all. But the time cultures we've built on top of it, just because you can synchronize with GPS satellites to microsecond accuracy between phones, doesn't mean you should stick to a 9-to-5 schedule with microsecond accuracy, right?
Well, sure, yeah.
So it's useful to have that. So think of it this way. The clock is a great slave, but a poor master, right? So you don't want to be slave to the clock. You want to be the master of the clock.
Okay.
But let's switch to the human side, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Right. So human side. And actually, GPS and Big Ben are actually very good bookmarks for that too, because my dating of the start of the subjective story. starts with Virginia Woolf's essay, Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown.
Which we can call sort of the rise of Kairos in a way, right?
Or the acknowledgement that Kairos was losing to Kronos. So it was the first recognition of the trough of the battle, which eventually led to the reversal.
Okay.
But one of the interesting things, this was, I don't know who pointed it out to me. It might have been in a paper somewhere that I've forgotten. But the structure of Virginia Woolf's original sort of pioneering novel, Mrs. Dalloway, is built around Big Ben. So if you search for the phrase Big Ben in Mrs. Dalloway, you'll find like a dozen references to Big Ben tolling. And the entire structure of the book, which kind of inaugurated the stream of consciousness mode of the literary genre, it's basically the subjective life experience of the characters, Mrs. Dalloway and others, being repeatedly interrupted by time signals from the external world. Big Ben's chiming being one of them. There's others, like a car backfiring, an airplane in the sky looping the loop or something. But it sort of is a very visceral fictional portrayal of the constant battle between Kairos and Kronos, the sense of internal subjective time and your stream of consciousness, memory, subjectivity, recall, all those things, and the external clock, which sort of inexorably marches on towards your death.
In Virginia Woolf's novels, as I recall, there's a lot of moving backward and forward in time, right? And that was one of the things in which she was a great innovator, right? And you contrast her with H.G. Wells. You call them both time travelers, right? But they're very different.
Yeah.
To describe the difference?
So this is not thought original to me. It's in the Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown essay, where Virginia Woolf actually discusses H.G. Wells as one of her sort of, not necessarily contemporaries. He was a couple of decades older than hers, but as like the previous generation of writers. And she frames the challenge of literary expression of her generation, which was, the Bloomsbury set, T.S. Eliot, others, all of whom, by the way, were very inspired by Henri Bergson's philosophies. They were very strongly influenced by his debates with Einstein. But anyway, so she frames her challenge as H.G. Wells and the writers of his generation were kind of like writers in the triumphant peak of industrialization, and they kind of like became heralds of Kronos, so to speak. So H.G. Wells' invention of the time travel story, which became a genre in itself, sort of focused on external objective time. It turned time into this objective dimension. You could move in like space. And
you move from one number to another, right? Yeah. You move from 2020 to whatever year you want in the past. One number to the other, right?
Yeah, and that's
that's it. And there's no different. I mean, 1942 is still 1942 and 2020 is still 2020. You just move between the two, right?
So that's the starting point of regular time travel fiction. But of course, if you don't read much science fiction, but if you look at the history of science fiction, that simple idea of time as a linear dimension you can move in can be turned incredibly subtle and interesting and complicated.
Totally.
And
I'm just saying that's what the H.G. Wells time traveling
that's
is.
where it starts.
Yeah, from one number to another.
Though I would say there's elements of the Woolfian way in his work as well. We'll get to that. Okay. But Woolf's approach is, all right, that's objective time. Let's talk about stream of consciousness as effectively an equivalent construct to a time machine as a way to talk about interior experience of time. And you can trace a two-pronged sort of history of science fiction from these two starting points, which actually get at the subjective sociology of time in the last century. So on the one hand, you have Virginia Woolf inaugurating an approach to thinking about time that then got developed with Ursula Le Guin's science fiction is wonderful as sort of a continuation of Virginia Woolf's work. Woolf herself brought up another important theme, which was the relationship between time and subjective identity. So, her book, Orlando, I think, is one of the first depictions of gender switching in time. So you have a character who lives a really long time and changes genders along the way, right? And that you see later works like, Myra Breckinridge. It turns into Doctor Who, which is contemporary science fiction story. We'll talk about that in a minute, but that identifies time with identity evolution, including regenerations of identity through gender and other aspects of identity. So Virginia Woolf inaugurated that kind of time subjectivity fiction. Ursula Le Guin sort of, I would say, is the logical successor to Virginia Woolf. And then you have Philip K. Dick, who kind of is a bridge figure between Ursula Le Guin and the more Kronos time travel fiction. So On the other side, H.G. Wells led to, Asimov, Heinlein, and all the other sort of classic science fiction writers who do all those things like the grandfather paradox, go back in time and kill your grandfather. All the tropes of science fiction come from there. And if you trace these two history, they play off against each other a little bit. Like even in H.G. Wells' original time traveler story, one of the things that happens is he travels to the future and discovers that humanity has evolved into two completely different species, the Eloi and the Morlocks. And there's an element of sort of identity evolution as an aspect of subjective temporality there. It's not the strongest element,
I see,
but it's there. And same thing with Virginia Woolf stuff. If you get to Ursula Le Guin, even though it's mainly about sort of subjective experience of time, her entire sort of extended universe of her works, it involves like little inventions in objective time travel as well. So one of her best works, which I really like, is The Lathe of Heaven, where it's kind of a mix between objective and subjective time travel stories, where there's this character who kind of dreams new realities into existence. Like each time he falls asleep and dreams something, reality changes to be in conformity with the dream. And nobody believes him, but I'm giving away the ending here. But one psychologist believes him, and that psychologist turns into a power-hungry maniac and tries to alter the world using his patient's dreams. So that's The Lathe of Heaven, and it's a wonderful bridge kind of time travel fiction story between objective and subjective time travel. So yeah, you look at these two, and they're kind of if you think of like science fiction as sort of a genre that holds up a mirror to technological modernity and the human reaction to technological modernity. This is, by the way, what I was saying to you before we started speaking. The reason engineers love science fiction, and most engineers love science fiction as a source of not just of like, very superficial innovation, like, hey, we saw a communicated device on Star Trek, therefore we're going to invent a cell phone. That's a very superficial level of inspiration. But engineering as a culture is very deeply shaped and informed by the reflection of itself that it sees in a mirror, mainly held up by science fiction. And you can see sort of much deeper versions of this going on. But, anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no. So, okay, so you have said, this is a quote, we've been going off the clock for 100 years now. And you have multiple examples to give us. So there was the rise of what we've been calling Chronos up until, I guess, the mid 20th century. And you've seen since then the rise of, I guess, Kairos, but people in various ways, what you say, going off the clock. So describe that.
Okay,
process.
So if you think about Virginia Woolf and the world she describes in 1920, her characters, you can think of them as Kairos under the siege of Chronos. So there's this oppressive, all-encompassing sense of external time that's oppressing their minds.
Because she's interested in what you call internal subjective time travel, which is what many of us do, or maybe all of us do at some point or another, right? We move backward and forward in time in our own minds.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And this is, by the way, a term of art in psychology.
Until the until the goddamn alarm clock goes off, which interrupts that pleasant dream state, right, of moving backward and forward in time, our subjective time travel. Okay.
Yeah, and it's a term of art in psychology, inner time travel. Oh, there's an interesting thing. I haven't yet dug up the sources. But speaking of alarm clocks and waking up in the morning, apparently one of the reasons we often have dreams which seem to logically end with an alarm going off is because our brain can actually construct subjective time in reverse. So it happens really fast. The lower layers of your auditory processing brain, they detect the alarm going off, and in just the microseconds it takes for it to hit consciousness and for you to start waking up, it fabricates a whole justification for the alarm clock going off by altering the plot of your dream so that it makes sense that, hey, you're running somewhere and the alarm clock went off. So this is sort of your brain doing backwards time travel in the few microseconds before you wake up.
Oh my God, we've been engineered, right? That's what you're describing, or we've engineered ourselves.
No, it can happen with like the crowing of a rooster. It's not anything particularly.
Are you talking about this phenomenon, which I've experienced, of waking up at the right time without an alarm clock going off? My body has been trained.
No, that's a weaker form. I'm actually talking about a much stronger form, which is if you happen to be dreaming when the alarm clock goes off, quite often your dream will actually make sense, and it'll make sense that it's ending with an alarm going off. Like you might the dream might turn into, hey, the house is on fire and therefore an alarm is going off. Now, if you think about it from a causal perspective, it makes no sense. You can't experience a fire in a dream that ends with a fire alarm going off without knowing the alarm is going to go off in the external world with your alarm clock, right? So clearly what's happening is your brain is receiving the signal of the alarm clock going off, and in the microseconds it takes for that to hit consciousness, it manufactures a sort of end to the dream that makes sense. And this kind of phenomenon is common in psychology. Like quite often you can do very subtle experiments which shows that our brain constructs a sense of time so that it makes sense rather than respecting chronology. So you can do other experiments that show this, and this is sort of a very subtle effect, but it's on the margins, you can detect it.
But your mind is still attempting to conform to the external world.
It's attempting to bring an inner experience of time in conformity with outer experience of time in the simplest, least burdensome way possible. So if it's simpler for you to think that effect happened before cause, the brain will actually fool you into thinking that. So that kind of temporal illusion is actually possible.
But it's a deep, am I right? It's a deep internalization of this external
No, it's not.
mechanism. I'm missing something here.
It's innate in neurophysiology.
Innate?
Yeah, I mean, it's innate, just like,
How can it be innate if time is an invention?
The invention happens on the substrate of sensory information coming in. That's why, so there's a lot of room for the brain to actually decide how it wants to construct time. And that happens between the deep unconscious and extreme conscious. And this is the reason, for example, optical illusions happen, right? So optical illusions, the reason they can happen is what we have in terms of visual perception is this very high level constructed reality based on sort of, our conceptual understanding of the world. So right now I'm looking at you and I'm parsing you as a human being with a head and a body, and I'm sort of compiling you into a model in my head, right? And optical illusions often depend on interrupting that construction process. So somewhere between like dots of light falling on your retina and being processed by the lower layers of your brain into like, lines and corners and moving, sweeping patterns and stuff, there's like 100 layers of processing that happen, and any of these can be hacked to alter your conceptions of time, space, orientation, movement. And this is like what half the psychologists in the world seem to spend their time studying sometimes, I feel. But anyway.
Use the term hacked. Hacking time.
Oh yeah, you can hack.
And that's what you're writing about. That's what you're studying right now. Is you're talking about hacking time, which is what's been happening for about a century now.
And it's what I want to sort of make sure people understand is this is not an artifact of modern technology. It's central to biology. You can find examples of it, like, in nature, all sorts of hacking of like parasites hacking the brains of, hosts and things like that.
Sure.
So there's lots. So it's sort of innate to biology that we construct our sense of time a certain way, and there's ways those things can get disrupted by,
But you show, right, that people have been using technology to hack time over the last 100 years to create
the particular example
to move away from Chronos, to create their own more to create more internal subjective time travel, etc.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. Let's get back to that. We're getting into a little bit of the esoteric side of this stuff, but the more practical stuff is a basic prototypical example I like to use is how our TV watching has changed, right? You have the Walter Cronkite era of appointment TV. This is the way the world is.
Now, remember, a lot of people are younger than we are, so they don't remember this. So it used to be that you couldn't schedule what time the shows were on. They came on at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, and you had no choice of the matter. You had to be there at that time to watch the show.
Exactly.
Nor could you record it to watch it later.
So this was before VHS, just on the air TV. And if you wanted to catch a show,
command and control, centralized. Command and control. Everybody's synchronized.
Yeah.
Everybody's synchronized to watch Walter Cronkite at 6 o'clock.
Yeah. So they didn't even just synchronize their sense of time. Like, Walter Cronkite comes on and it's 7 p.m. or whatever the broadcast time was. But you also know that this is when we synchronize our sense of reality, because Walter Cronkite would tell you that this is the way the world is, right? You synchronize time and reality and created consensus reality out of it.
Yeah.
And look at how that started unraveling. And by the way, this started happening just when time culture was peaking. 1978, I think Cronkite's last broadcast was like 82 or something. But that's when GPS satellites were first launched, 1978 to 82, the constellation was launched. But look at how we slowly took back control of time, and some of it is hacking, but most of it is not. most of it is like actually designed invention. So the VCR first gave us control over, all right, I'm just going to tape this damn thing and watch it later, right? DVRs, streaming, and all the way to today. Today, you basically have all video content living in this sort of space that's time outside of time. And you can think of it as ionic space. It's like a space where time doesn't exist. It's the server world of like just digital files of video programs, and then you on demand can pull them in any order, any sequence. If you want, you can watch a show completely backwards. You can synchronize it with your friends if you want to, like, have a watch party for the latest Game of Thrones episode. But if you want to like say, hey, I'm just going to watch this 5 years later when it's out of the zeitgeist, you can do that. You can, like, I don't watch Game of Thrones. Some shows I've caught up on like a decade after they were popular. Like Futurama ended, I think, in 2013 or something. But I fell in love with Futurama, the animated cartoon show, I think in 2017. And I've binge rewatched it like 5 times since then. So if you think of what I'm doing in terms of control of time, I've been doing objective time travel back to 2000 to 2013, the original airing period of Futurama. I've gone back and relived that era 4 times since 2017 or something, right? Yeah. And that's what I mean by...
You said relived. You going to stand by that word?
Pretty much, because I think people vastly underestimate the extent to which our experience of life itself is shaped by sort of, the media we consume. Right? And like an extreme example of this I really love is, I mentioned this guy in one of my talks on the subject, but I forget his name now. Eric something. Eric Haberman.
In Ohio.
Hagerman. Yeah.
Hagerman.
Hagerman.
I love this guy too. It's funny that you brought him up. It's Haberman. Eric Haberman. Because I followed the story too at the time, and I think it's just so fascinating and so instructive. But you bring this fabulous new angle to it. Go ahead, tell the story.
Okay, so I think it's Hagerman actually, not Haberman, but we can look it up afterwards. But the New York Times did a profile on this guy, but this guy was so traumatized by the 2016 election and Trump coming to power and stuff.
He's a liberal. He hated Trump. Yeah.
Half the country reacted that way. But his reaction was particularly interesting and imaginative and creative and extreme. So what he did was he retreated to a pig farm in Ohio, shut himself off from all news sources and all current events. Like his friends were not allowed to talk to him about the news or anything.
He cut off himself from all information about the outside world.
Yeah. And he retreated to basically, I guess, reading classics or something from earlier eras. So you could think of this guy as basically creating a time warp bubble that for him
it had no Donald Trump in it. That's all he needed.
Yeah. It had frozen at 2016. He had little excursions to like classics era. I don't know. Maybe he was reading Greek classics, or maybe he was traveling back to 800 BC a few times. I don't know what he was.
Should we go tell him that everything's fine? He can come back and no one's in concentration camps.
So he's created a little sort of time island for himself. So that's a very crudely constructed temporality. So this is like constructed time. It's crudely constructed at the levels of like social and political narratives. But increasingly we are getting control of our time experience in deeper and deeper ways where you can hack it at the level of brains.
Yeah. So, this guy, I think our position on him is the same, which is that he doesn't live in 2020.
Yeah.
Right. He really doesn't live now.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. He has created not just a different time or demolished time. He has created a different life, a different objective reality.
Yeah, you could say that because, and this is not even, it's not constructionism in sort of postmodern loose sense of we can just make everything up.
We never do that on this show.
It is that, but it goes deeper than that, right? Because if you look at physics conceptions of time, like bringing it back all the way back around to the hardest understandings of time we have, increasingly in modern theories of physics, our sense of time is impossible to decouple from our sense of information flows. And time so this is Carlo Rovelli, the Order of Time book that I mentioned, and he's one of the developers of one of the most interesting modern theories of fundamental physics. It's called loop quantum gravity. And his theory of time is basically that time is let me see if I can state this without completely screwing it up. But his physics model of time is that the future is the direction of maximal ignorance or something like that. So time evolves in the direction from what we know the most about to what we know the least about. So it's the arrow of time points from knowledge to ignorance. And this is a physics understanding of time in terms of like, how light happens and how waves interact with particles and all that shit. So in my sort of more arrogant moments, I think I understand it, but I certainly can't explain it. But Rovelli's book is like remarkably lucid and totally understandable even to like, non-science and engineering people.
Lay people? Okay.
Yeah. So I would say, even though the Hagerman's story of retreating to a pig farm based on like, political events, it sounds like a very shallow, crude kind of constructionism at the level of like inhabiting the public sphere, basically. So a sort of more skeptical way of reading this would be it has nothing to do with time. This is just a guy who got burned and retreated to do some self-care and heal and recuperate.
Or more like he's crazy is more likely would be said. But
real time is really still what the rest of us are experiencing who are actually keeping up with the news. And he's still living in that time. He just doesn't know as much as we do. Something like that, right? So that's the skeptical argument. And I take that seriously. That argument has merit to it. But this opposing argument that what he's experiencing is not just sort of an information filter bubble, he's literally experiencing a different subjective and objective time. That is the case for that is much stronger than people realize.
Yeah. Okay. I thought I need to tell a personal story. In preparing for this interview, I started thinking about someone I rarely think about because we don't speak. It's my brother. My parents divorced when I was 5 and he was 2. And the theory is that this did a lot more damage to him because of his age at the time than it did to me. He was just less developed. Well, regardless of the cause, what happened with my brother soon after the divorce was that he started wearing capes, like Superman capes, Batman capes, and he started to read comic books. And he said that he was Superman, or he was Batman, or he was Spider-Man, and he inhabited those characters. He became those characters in his own mind, and he's now, as far as I know, 3 years younger than me, so he's 51, and he's still there. From there, he went on to doing role-playing games that featured like Marvel or like superhero characters. Role-playing games, not with video games, where they would sit around a table like Dungeons and Dragons, except that they were actual superhero characters. And you'd make your own character, you would inhabit that role, you would play with other people, and you would be in this world, this alternate universe. It'd be not a dungeon master, but I guess it's called a game master who would create a world. And as far as I know, every week since he was 2, he's been doing this with a group of people on a regular basis, like weekly, sometimes daily. And this is why we don't speak, because when he talks about Star Trek and Star Wars and Marvel and Spider-Man and this universe and that universe. And either I don't understand it because I don't get the references, or it's just boring, or it's just he lives in that world much of the time, right? Or many worlds much of the time. Worlds that are very different than mine. I never went that route. I went into what I thought was objective reality. I said, Jake, that's not real. What's real is politics, man. You gotta be in politics to be real and to be a good person. And so I went that route, which I thought was, the material objective reality. So even though it's difficult for me to be around him, we have very little to talk about. Like, I do respect, and I think it's true that he simply created his own world and he lives there and it's as real as mine.
Yeah, and I think this is a realization that we are kind of coming to almost as a collective realization as a species. It's almost like a consciousness raising moment that humanity is experiencing now, that your brother was actually kind of in a sense a pioneer. Like
he was back in the 1970s,
due to his trauma and other reasons. And I mean, if you look at your world, you're a historian of, among other things, politics, and you look at how we've gone from Karl Rove's idea in about 20 years ago when he said, we dismiss the reality-based community and we are an empire, we make our own reality. You're familiar with this episode, right?
Sure, yeah.
And it was the beginning of our current sort of political era of, all right, there's quote unquote the reality-based community, and then there is the we make our own reality crowd. The modern incarnation of that is, Trump's gang talking about we are presenting alternative facts. But whether you find that distasteful or not, I think what we're all beginning to realize is that what we designate as reality is simply a matter of consensus. And the way I framed it most recently on Twitter sometime like a couple of years back was normalcy is just the majority sect of magical thinking. So if you want to let that phrase sit for a minute, the way I think of it is, if 51% of people agree that reality is a certain way and they admit certain facts into the discourse and then they construct a particular narrative based on those facts, that's all it is. It doesn't actually stand on anything firmer than that. And it could change radically in 100 years. If you go back 500 years ago when people mostly had a very literalist belief in religion, it was completely different. And it's hard for us to come to terms with the fact that even though a Spider-Man or Superman universe like the kind your brother inhabits, I don't know with what degree of like irony or literalism, but there are people who are very literalist about it and not at all ironic.
Right.
Between that and the kind of like, reality-based understanding of politics and stuff that we think we inhabit, it's a matter of degree, not kind. So it's a question of, all right, in relativistic terms, both are these sort of escapist fictions that are in sort of this reality testing loop, right? And some collapse more easily than others. Some go on extended binges longer, but they're the same kind of thing. It's a matter of degree, not...
Yeah. So you know where I went? Instead of to Marvel superheroes, I went to back in time. I became a historian.
Yeah.
Right? That's exactly. And I spent much of my life, my world is in other times. That's what I do. I also think about the future a whole lot too. I think about places I've never been, never will be, have never seen, but I think about them. That's what politics is, right? Oh, the people of Bangladesh need food and water and shelter and blah, blah, blah. They need our help or something, right? It's always about other people that you don't even see. And their past traumas and what they need in the future. And we're always living in the past and the future. Now I'm starting to think of Buddhism, right? And its insistence that we live in the present.
So that's one extreme you can go to, this notion of like, transience and reality being sort of constructed and all that stuff.
But I mean, I'm sorry, but I was just going to say, like, my brother Jake was not the only person escaping his time. I was too. I was escaping it by going into politics and history.
And this is one of those always already things, as postmodernists like to say. We've always been doing this. We just have the technological affordances now to do it in more radical and powerful ways than ever before.
Cool. Let's do this now. So tell us, what's the future, man, Mr. Time Traveler?
Let's go back into the past to look at the future. Like we've talked about, how your brother constructed reality out of like superhero fiction, and you constructed it out of like, notions of history in the past and so forth. You go back 500 years, you find like people in the equivalent of superhero universes were religions and, literalist belief in religious doctrine and so forth. But let's take it down a couple of abstraction levels and, from the Hagerman political narrative or Marvel superhero universe down to something that's not quite as extreme as like, Buddhists meditating or like, an acid trip or something like that, but something in between that's much more familiar. I like to keep going back to something that's within, common experience that we don't realize how radical it is. And what I want to talk about is alcohol and coffee. So this is this very weird heterodox big history of the West that the Enlightenment can be attributed to a switch from beer and wine as the primary thing to... This
is page 11 of my book, I believe. Yeah, exactly. The founding fathers denounced drinking alcohol during the American Revolution and started to promote coffee drinking. And coffee houses took off in all the American cities right after the Revolution.
Yeah, so that was the American version, and a version of this story is that this is what drove the Enlightenment as well. Like the switch from like, initially coffee coming in from the Middle East and Turkey, and then later tea once trade with China was established. So coffee and tea are stimulants, whereas beer and wine are depressants. And if you think about that hits our constructed temporality at a level of abstraction that's maybe 4 or 5 layers below the level at which we are, traumatized by Trump getting elected or something. So drinking coffee or alcohol. So there's a phrase that really resonated with me from one of Alain de Botton's, I forget how to pronounce his name, but his book, I forget which one, of The Pleasures and Sorrows of Work, where he describes the modern 9-to-5 routines as the hard takeoffs and landings of coffee and alcohol. 9 o'clock, coffee, boom, you're off like a rocket, and you crash at 6 p.m., come home, and you have to have a drink, right?
That's what work will do to you.
Yeah, but this has been going on, right? That's at the level of the 9 to 5 routine. Then you look at history and the Enlightenment, and switching from wine default to coffee default, and you can see this. Like, you're a historian, so maybe you can provoke somebody to do this or do it yourself. I would love to see a proper. I've written a blog post on this, but I would like to see a proper history of the shift in temporality driven by ordinary everyday stimulants and depressants. So not like hard drugs or anything, or like the kinds of like ayahuasca kind of rituals that extremists might get into, but just coffee, tea, carbs, proteins, every sort of aspect of like the chemicals you put in your body, how that alters sort of your experience of time. And like I saw this map recently that the entire world has only 2 basic words for tea. There are variants of te and there's variants of chai. Like so India, for example, is chai, right? And it turns out the difference is whether you got tea from China by land or sea. Yeah. That's the basic difference. But that got me, all right, that's an interesting sort of linguistic spatial understanding of the spread of tea. I would like to see a temporal impact of the spread of tea. Like, how did it alter consciousness? How did people start telling stories and performing culture differently? How did rituals start to build up around consumption of tea and coffee, right? Like, for example, in India, North India is a very chai-centric country, and South India is a very coffee-centric country. Coffee rituals are central to life in South India. Like, my grandfather would get grumpy if he didn't have his perfect filter coffee, right?
Okay,
yeah. And same thing, like North India is chai. Like, if you visit a farm in the heartland of agrarian North India, there will constantly be a kettle of spicy chai going all the time. And they're like endlessly drinking chai. And this must be relatively recent when tea made its way from China to India. And I'm like, how the hell did farmers live and function and sort of ritually organize their life in North India before tea?
Right.
Yeah. And there were versions of alcohol like rice toddy and like, Persian brews and stuff.
I have a couple of examples that might be appropriate here. They're about harder drugs though. And then these are only anecdotal, but I think they're right. So I have heard that in the 1980s, when cocaine was rampant in the music industry in particular, that you can hear that there's actually beats per minute are actually much higher in music that's produced in the 1980s. And we don't know for sure, but we're damn sure that the vast majority of music producers were doing cocaine in the 1980s. Yeah. But the beats per minute are clearly higher in the 1980s. That's one example, possibly. The other is very contemporary, which is bedevils me daily because my son is 18 years old and he listens to this music and I can't stand it. The new hip hop with trap music, and also it's called mumble rap. So the drug of choice in hip hop in the last 5 to 10 years, drugs of choice are no longer cocaine and alcohol. It's now Xanax and marijuana and codeine. Okay. Yeah. So depressant, right? And you hear, so the beats are very slow now in contemporary hip hop. And then the rapping is much slower and they don't say much either. And it is very much this kind of languorous pace and languorous feel to it. I gotta think that the chemicals have something to do with it.
Absolutely. And I think you will find version of this no matter where you look in music culture. Like you've got like classical Western music theory that talks about like growing dissonance as you go from like Beethoven and Mozart all the way to like Stravinsky or whatever. And I wonder how much of it has to do with whatever they were consuming at that point, right? Non-Western example, in Indian music, the broad history of the classical music is it used to be one unified tradition before the Islamic invasions of between 900 to 1100 AD, and then North and South Indian classical music kind of diverged. And the forms of music that predate the Islamic invasions, it's called Dhrupad. And Dhrupad is, like you just described, more contemporary music. It's this really slow, languorous style of music where it might take like an hour or two of like, 3 notes per minute kind of like exploration of a raga before you slowly accelerate into what would be the absolute slowest tempos of the most modern versions of that tradition. And it's like, all right, One part of it is the impact of Islamic culture and whatever the hell they were drinking and eating and how that affected North Indian music. Another aspect you can see is South Indian music, which was relatively immune to the Islamic colonization, evolved on a separate fork, and it has become much more regimented, clock-like, formalist. And it's like, all right, so both kind of speeded up, but North Indian music went from this slow, almost meditative to still meditative, but slightly faster tempo with lots of forms borrowed from like Persian and Middle Eastern music. South Indian music became like this conservative island where it became increasingly technical and almost mathematical in structure, which I think of as like partly a stylistic and aesthetic retreat from Islamic influence. But also I wonder, coffee kind of made its way into South India around that time. And I'm like, maybe this is like coffee jitters showing up in Carnatic music.
I'll see your South Indian music, and I'll raise you another one from American pop music, which is, this is obvious, I don't know why I didn't think of this before, psychedelic drugs in the 1960s and 1970s, right? The use of psychedelic drugs and the rise of the jam bands, right? And so you'd have these, 10, 20, 30-minute Jerry Garcia solos, right, on the guitar, in which he and the audience were tripping, was the word. Tripping, taking a trip away somewhere else. You have your own experience. It's quite elaborate, quite extensive, can last a very long time or no time at all.
Absolutely.
Okay. While you're listening to Jerry solo endlessly. And now it's, I guess, Fish is doing the same thing or something.
I went to a Fish concert. That is one of the, it's one of the 3 or 4 Western sort of pop concerts I've been to since I've...
You poor man.
Yeah, I'm not a big music guy. I can't handle like concert audiences. But that Fish concert was surprisingly sort of like, I didn't realize I could actually listen and not get bored with it.
Really?
Partly because it has the same quality as raga music, which is probably my favorite genre, which is it just takes an endless amount of like slow exposition to build up the musical themes. And it's like, this is going on for much longer than I'm used to like Western pop songs to go on. Like you can actually look at like average song durations. Like the average Bollywood Hindi song is perhaps 5 to 7 minutes, and the average Western pop song is probably 3 minutes, I would say. And concert stuff, I think you can see similar differences in like typical pieces. And Fish actually sounded to me like its duration was kind of more on the raga end of the spectrum.
It's funny. It sounds to me like a car crash. But anyway,
I enjoyed it, but I haven't listened to it since.
So you claim to be an engineer who doesn't make value judgments, but I'm pretty sure I have quoted you. I have a quote from you where you say, I think you used the word should use clocks less. Correct? Is this okay, good. Tell us, I know you sort of explained how we've already started doing this. We've started using clocks less over the last 100 years or so. How is it happening right now, and how do you see it? What are the opportunities? Because I would like to use clocks less. What should we be doing to use clocks less now?
So the should is an engineering sort of value judgment. As an engineer, I think anything that requires a clock should be outsourced to a machine. Because machines are so much better than us at actually keeping synchronized, accurate time.
Cool.
So robots, automation, software, algorithms, all of that, anything that requires time precision on the order of like seconds, you certainly should give it to machines.
Let the robots and machines internalize the clock.
Oh yeah, and they already have. Like today, so to continue the story I interrupted like 20 minutes ago, after GPS, the continued evolution of timekeeping actually happened on computers and the internet. So the next big milestone after the GPS clock was what's called the Network Time Protocol, NTP. So this was in the mid-'80s. It's basically the time standard of the internet. It's the way computers can talk to each other and sort of stay in sync enough to talk, right? It's the reason when I send you an email, our timestamps will actually match up. It's so that's time on the computer. So there's this phrase popular in Silicon Valley, software eating the world. A big aspect of that is software eating clocks.
Yay.
So anything that computers can do with time, you should let them do. But you need to be in control of the process. So a place where the battle is really raging right now is in the algorithmic timeline versus the chronological timeline on social media. So both Twitter, Facebook, all these social media sites that are organized around the stream metaphor of consuming information. So basically a scrolling page of like updates moving. If you look back 15, 20 years ago, all these feeds were reverse chronological. So you would see the latest tweet first and the next latest and so forth. So they basically conform to objective linear time. And at some point, the big platforms realized that there was no particular reason to show these things in the same time order. They could take control of the temporal ordering of tweets, what to show you, what not to show you. And that was the rise of non-chronological feeds. And that's why when you go to Twitter now and Facebook, both of them, they'll show you an option, I think it's the top left or right corner, where you can switch from show the top stories or top tweets first, or show the latest stories or latest things first. And if you pick one, you're basically saying, let the machine curate my feed for me. If you pick the other, you're like, screw the machines. I'm going to override the autopilot and run it myself.
You get to choose what is timely.
Exactly. Well, at the moment you don't. You get to decide who gets to choose for you. Is it the clock that's going to choose, or the server?
Yeah, but you're still choosing.
Yeah. And so that's a big direction of innovation in software and technology now, which is, can you build systems of software intermediation of time experience that do a more reasonable job of dividing agency between you and a business that needs to make money of giving you services. There's a sort of reaction to this that can be extremely political, which is, how dare Facebook and Twitter take over my feed and control my sense of time by deciding what to show me when. I hate it. That's one reaction. The other more reasonable reaction, in my opinion, is, hey, this is a service you can opt into. It has to make money in certain ways. There's certain good and bad design patterns it uses. Some are oppressive, some are not. But you get to choose. And hey, if you don't like it, you can always go learn the technology and invent a better one and try to build a viable business out of it, right? And people are doing that. And even big platforms are responding to sort of the reactions. And the latest, for example, the latest iOS updates, the last few versions have featured what's called a night mode. It changes the color setting. It turns off alerts during the night. So yeah, you're slowly regaining control. The platforms are ceding some control of time experience to you. You can, if you're a hacker and you can build your own things, you can do a lot more. I know hackers who build their own Twitter interface and they completely control how tweets are presented to them. So you can do these things, right? I mean, the agency is out there depending on how much you're willing to grab for yourself. And this stuff is only going to get harder and more interesting and more powerful as more and more technology comes online. Virtual reality and augmented reality. Imagine what you can do with that now, right?
Yeah, talk about tripping. Yes.
Totally.
That's right.
You go to Disneyland or something now, these are the earliest versions of completely crafting a sort of your sensory environment in time and space and all five senses. But virtual reality gives you a way to basically build a Disneyland for yourself that fits in a helmet mounted on your head. And this is going to be very powerful.
You think so?
Yeah, I'm working on a game with a couple of my friends that's basically a maze navigation game. And one of the ways we're thinking of it is, it's kind of a platform on which anybody can design their own mazes and create their own little Disneyland in their heads. And this is right now just a computer game that you play on a flat screen. But I hope someday we can create a 3D version where it's like, wow. And by the way, my research on time, which I'm trying to turn into a book, I'm also trying to turn into a playable maze. So in my office, which we walked through, it's on my wall.
I asked you your opinion because we are in discussions with a virtual reality firm, basically, in Seattle, the Seattle area, a couple of them actually, who want to do VR with us. Podcasts, we actually thought about having a 360 camera right here between you and me, but doing virtual reality courses for Renegade University too. And so the whole question is just how big is this going to become, right? If it's going to be the next thing, then it's something to invest in for us.
It's going to be huge. It's not yet there, but it's getting closer and closer. Have you tried VR headsets?
Yes.
Okay, so you know where to start.
Oh yeah, I was in Cambodia for an hour. I definitely was.
Yeah, but there's lots of it's at the stage, I would say, where personal computers were in 1978 or so, homebrew computer club. You kind of had to be half a hacker to actually make them work for you.
Even with the new Oculus?
Yeah.
Okay. I haven't used the new one, but
and partly because they haven't figured out lots of things. I think the nausea problem still hasn't been solved for lots of people.
Oh, people get sick?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. These things can make you sick if you have the right kind of brain chemistry going. Right. But these are things that you have to deal with. You're hacking into the brain in extremely powerful ways. And I'll give you just one example to show you how very powerful it is. So NVIDIA is the company that makes GPUs, and most high-end graphics solutions are driven by NVIDIA. So they published a paper on how to create infinite walking experiences. So if you put on a VR headset, you're probably going to be in a room with 4 walls that are maybe 10 feet apart. And if you try to create a walking experience, you're going to run into a wall, right?
Oh, damn. External reality. Damn it.
Yeah. And there's 2 basic solutions to that. One is a kind of crude external world version of it, which is, a 2D treadmill, basically. So you put yourself on a 2D treadmill, you create infinite walking that way. But the way NVIDIA figured out is it can actually hack the brain to graft an infinite walking illusion on top of a circular walking reality. So here's how it works. Your eyes, they exhibit this behavior called saccades. So when you're looking anywhere, your eyes don't point in the exactly same direction continuously. What they do is unconsciously, they do these little darting motions, like looking around. And the reason the eyes do this is it wants to kind of update its picture of its entire environment. So these are called saccades, these unconscious, uncontrolled movements, which your eyes you're looking straight ahead, and they're doing little jittery movements around in a cone, right? So these are called saccades. Now, what happens is that your brain actually skips a beat when it's doing these saccades. You don't notice it. To you, the image still seems stable and like you're looking in the same direction. And what the brain is doing is, during these microseconds when the eye is doing the physical saccade, it kind of patches over with what you just saw before and what you'll continue to see in a few seconds. So it's creating this little bridge illusion. So you get the sense that you're focusing straight. And so this is the biological reality. Jesus. And talking of hacking, the NVIDIA research shows that with the right kind of VR headset, you can detect these rapid movements, the onset of these rapid movements. And during that movement, you can shift the field of view by a few degrees so that when you come back to focusing on what's in front of you, the field is actually shifted by a few degrees. So you'll start walking in a circle, but you'll think you're walking in an infinite straight line. So you've just hacked your sense of space completely.
Whoa.
By hacking into saccades, by shifting the virtual field of view. And this is the level at which we're hacking our experience of space. And you can do the same with time. And I think the research on doing this to time is much earlier stage than doing it with space, but same sorts of things are possible.
I know you resist calling yourself a postmodernist or a relativist, but dude, I think ironically, you just proved it's right.
Oh, totally. I don't resist those labels at all.
Oh, you don't? Okay, cool.
I totally love those labels, but I think I buy them in a much more sort of classical 1960s Baudrillard era approach. There's what I think of as quote unquote the real postmodernism, and then there's this sort of weird straw man that's been constructed as part of the culture wars, where they call it cultural Marxism.
Total
or something.
nonsense.
So I think that's bullshit.
Total nonsense.
Yeah, so that's become a politicized piece of bullshit. But the rest of reality is actually shaping up exactly like how the postmodernists predicted in the 60s. So I totally buy that.
Oh, right on.
And I'm totally leaning into it with all the guns I can bring to it. So
he's with us, people. We got him. Hey,
yeah, I've always been with you. If you thought I wasn't, I don't know why.
I was going to say you sure sounded like us. But hey, your work, your mind, thrilling, brilliant, and liberating. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks for having me on.
Fantastic. This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To experience the new Renegade University, go to renegadeuniversity.com. Thanks for listening.